The big one, baby. The big, giant, monster Death Star idea. Plato's theory of forms. This, you've probably never heard of it. If you have, boy, you're going to be enlightened today. But wow, it is everywhere. It permeates. It is like the carbonation in your mental pop. It is everywhere. It's kind of like the Force in Star Wars, but with a little bit of additional mysticism, collectivism, and totalitarianism thrown into the mix. And if you've ever been around kids or raised kids, it's an amazing thing. Like, say to a toddler, that's a table. Say it to them 2, 3, 4 times, and boom, they are locked and loaded. They are ready to laser-like precision point out what a table is and know what a table is for the rest of their natural-born life. That is an amazing thing when you think about it. And we can see and identify a table in a doll's house, even though it would never be used for human consumption. We can see a low Japanese table and say, that's a table. It's a table. We know. We know it. It's an amazing thing that we're able to do. And philosophy and philosophers have been trying to figure out this for thousands of years. It was actually, I think, the very first video that I did, like 10 plus years ago. Somebody just the other day put a comment on that. First! Pretty funny. So, Plato's answer to this was really interesting, because he said the way that we know what a table is before we're born. I know it sounds kind of weird, but stay with it. He said before we're born, we're floating in this otherworldly dimension, this ether, this super sensual or suprasensual environment, this alternate dimension. And we're floating, our soul is floating around, and we see a succession of perfect things, and we absorb their nature. We see a perfect table. We see a perfect ball, a perfect triangle, a perfect circle. Absolutely perfect. Unconstrained by any material concerns. You know, like you take a pencil and you draw a circle. If you zoom in, it's all, blurry and ragged and so on. And what is a straight line? You draw it. I mean, you paint it. It's always good. But you see in the realm beyond the senses before you're born, absolutely perfect everything. And then when you get to Earth, you have this dim unconscious memory of the perfection of things around you, and you're able to identify a table because you have this memory of this perfect table in your mind that you saw before you were born. And he says, of course, and I've done this allegory of the cave on the show, the purpose is to stop looking at things themselves and start looking at the ideal behind them. Discard the material and go for the perfect. And of course, there's religion involved in this, there's godhood involved in this, but that is his answer to the question of how we get such amazing, accurate concepts. And he said that this applied not just to physical objects, but to mental constructs or concepts like honor and dignity and so on, and virtue, and courage and so on. And we see these perfect things, not just physical things, but also philosophical ideals, emotional states, you name it. It's an amazing idea. It's a very powerful idea, because we all know in human society there is a division, because there's things that we can, tangibly see with our senses. We can see, touch, taste, smell. And then there are things that we can't see that are actually usually more important to us in terms of how our lives are organized. You can't see the nation. You can't see the state. You can see buildings and guys with guns and people, banging gavels and so on, but you can't see the state. God does not respond to direct sense perception. The will of the majority, again, we can't see it. You see, we're bound up. We live in a chamber or a prison or a world of concepts. Concepts organize us and run us, not individuals. And that is a very fact. When you really get that, how much of your mind is conditioned to obey concepts, it's really fascinating. Now, of course, concepts don't speak for themselves. The will of the majority doesn't speak for itself, so you need eloquent, often sophists to get up there and speak for the will of the majority, and so on. And the democracy is not walking up to your door, knocking on it and saying, here's what I think the collective should do. And so you need again, usually sophists, politicians, and so on, to go and inform the crowd, whip up the crowd, often provoke resentments within the crowd, and then claim to speak for the crowd, and so on. So concepts can't speak for themselves. But if you can portray yourself to the mob as someone who speaks for the general good or a particular god or the will of the people or the destiny of the nation or whatever it is, if you can be someone who credibly claims to speak for that, then people will obey you, because they don't think they're obeying an individual. They think they're surrendering to a concept, and our minds run so much on concepts that we feel much more comfortable obeying a concept than we do obeying an individual. So that's Plato's theory of the forms in a few minutes. Now, there have been a lot of complicated rebuttals to this question, to this idea. Now, remember, of course, Plato was writing before, I mean, there was Democritus, there was ideas, Lucretius, there are ideas of atoms and so on, but they hadn't been sort of established in the modern context. And I think we have concepts because there are atoms, like our highest abstractions respond to the basic nature of matter and reality. And atoms plus purpose, well, that's a very different thing, and that's where our accuracy comes from. But the rebuttals to Plato's forms it's been quite a cottage industry in philosophy. Aristotle was very negative towards them. He was more of an empiricist. He says, look, we see a whole bunch of tables, we understand their purpose, we have 4 legs and a top, a flat top, it doesn't matter what they're used for. The difference between a table and a desk could be drawers, like we understand what things are through repeated exposure and the abstraction of matter and purpose, in particular for human forms, or matter without purpose in the form of trees, without human purpose. The tree has a purpose, but it's not a human purpose. So he said we accumulate a bunch of experiences and we abstract from that. Now that's fascinating, because if you have an ideal abstraction that is bigger and greater than individual manifestations of that abstraction, in other words, if you have a concept of chair that's bigger than each individual chair, then you can have a concept that's different from each individual instance. Now that doesn't sound that important with regards to chairs, but if you have something like that old Star Trek goofy line, everyone thinks it's philosophy, it's not, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one or the few. Well, there's no such thing as the needs of the many, right? And there's no way to define the needs of the many. If you could, then central planning and communism would work. And so what are the needs of the many? It's a concept that you're supposed to surrender to. That's supposed to be bigger than your own individual needs. And someone is going to claim to speak for the needs of the many, the will of the good, the will of the collective, or whatever it is, and it's going to be a disaster because they can't possibly define these things. And even if they could go around and interview someone, their needs may be manipulative. I need $1 million, whatever it is. And so Aristotle pushed back hard against this, because if you say all of our concepts are derived from each specific instance, then if there's a contradiction between each specific instance and the concept has to be adapted to the specific instance, right? If I say, well, there's a possibility that a chair could be on fire and burnt down to a crisp and ashes and still be a chair, we'd have to say, well, no, because it doesn't have 4 legs, you can't sit in it, and so on. And so if you have a concept that contradicts the characteristics of any individual entity, then your concept is invalid. Like if you have a scientific theory that is contradicted by experimental evidence, empirical evidence, your scientific theory is invalid. Now there's another one as well, which is to say, okay, let's say there's an ideal, a perfect form of the good. Well, what does that even mean? What is the good? The good in terms of what is virtue? Let's look at courage. What is the ideal form of courage? I don't know. It is an excess of courage is called, by Aristotle, an excess of courage is called foolhardiness, rushing into battle when you're not armed and so on. Very courageous, but very self-destructive. A deficiency of courage is called cowardice, where you could win, but you don't fight anyway because you're just scared and you surrender to your fear. Fear can be healthy, fear can be destructive. So what is the ideal for courage if it can include both running towards an enemy and running away from an enemy, depending on your relative strengths and capabilities of victory? So what does that mean? What does it mean to have courage? We understand that a deficiency of love is cold-heartedness, and excess of love could be, obsession and stalking and so on, an excess of attachment. What does that mean? An excess of honesty can be destructive to you and your relationships. A deficiency of honesty can also, what is the ideal for honesty if it can include withholding information and sharing information? So these are very fascinating and interesting questions, and I come down more